I can barely stand, I've got vitamin deficiencies, my eyes are bleary and unfocused, I think I might have deep vein thrombosis, and I definitely have carpal tunnel syndrome. I've just finished the colossal, monstrously huge Pillars of Eternity in time to record this review, and once I've finished doing that, I think I might just start the whole thing over again. Rest assured, Kickstarter backers and CRPG fans, Pillars of Eternity is just as great as you hoped it would be. Just be thankful you don't have a deadline to finish it in. So you are a stranger newly arrived in the country of Deerwood, a huge landmass dotted with colonial settlements and ancient ruins. The war between foreign settlers and the native Glanfathans, a Celtic-influenced spin on Native American tribes, has technically ended, but understandably the locals are still far from happy at intrusions on their holy sites. About 5 minutes into the game and they're already hurling axes at you. There's so much going on in the world that attempting to sum up the backstory would take me about 3 or 4 hours, but suffice to say that along with the ongoing colonial tension, there's also the fallout from a religious war that's very nearly torn the fledgling Deerwooden nation in two. Right near the start of the game, something very important happens to you, something which inextricably links you to the fortunes of the entire country and maybe even the world. Yet this is an RPG after all. Given free rein to design their own universe, the team at Obsidian have created a stunningly well realised fantasy world, one which maintains a lot of the core elements fantasy fans will be familiar with, but gives them some really interesting twists. For example, I love the switch over to a late Middle Ages setting, which allows for the introduction of things like firearms and Renaissance era armour. The game's theology is dark and complex, with a pantheon of gods far less binary in disposition than the good versus evil deities of traditional D&D. Without wishing to spoil the story, which touches on this pretty heavily, themes of reincarnation, death, rebirth, and the nature of a being's soul are prominent. The writing is uniformly excellent, complex, and full of ideas, and crucially it treats the player with respect. Tonally, it feels a lot closer to the metaphysical and spiritual musing of Planescape Torment than the high fantasy of Baldur's Gate. The main plot itself does take a little while to get going, but once the rousing second act climax plays out, it builds up to a really terrific conclusion. There's an excellent villain, though he's not the cackling, moustache-twirling sort, and he has his own motivations, and it's all the more effective for it. Plenty of neat twists in the tale, and lots of opportunities for the player to impact proceedings. I barely had the time for one playthrough for this review, but I'm already itching to start over with a new character and make some different choices to see how the story shifts along. The art style is astoundingly good. Those ultra crisp painted backgrounds are so sharp and detailed that you could almost sink into them, each map sketched with painstaking detail and care. Waterfalls roar past ancient, moss-covered ruins, sun twinkling on the rushing river below. Deer skitter away as your party heads deeper into the woods, bursting into a clearing where a group of Glanfathan hunters wait with axes and bows drawn. For all the high-tech wizardry of modern RPG graphics engines, there's something magical about the painterly style of Pillars. Each new map you encounter is another treat to be savoured as you slowly strip away the fog of war. The visual design, down to the weapons and armour models, is cohesive and beautiful, and it just makes you really want to explore more of this world. As for character creation, it's robust enough that I spent around 9 hours choosing my character's race and finer background details. Your choice of classes ranges from your familiar fighters and barbarians to wizards and priests, and more esoteric classes like ciphers and chanters. Each class has a bunch of cool abilities that make them feel powerful in their own right. Taking fighters as an example, which are usually the vanilla choice for most newcomers to this kind of game, they're no longer the sword-swinging training dummies they were in the Baldur's Gate series, and instead pack a handful of abilities that allow them to lock down their enemies, knock them prone, or charge into the fray to get up close and personal with an enemy as quickly as possible. And that's not the only thing that's been improved from the games that inspired Pillars of Eternity. Obsidian haven't merely recreated systems, they've gone in under the hood to improve everything that was frustrating about the isometric CRPG and enhance everything that already worked really well. For example, a fast travel speed has been added to make crossing those huge areas you've already explored less tedious, and alternatively, a half speed option gives you much more time to think in combat. Loot is blessedly free of the fiddly inventory management that sometimes marred the original games, with everything that isn't a direct use item or a wearable bit of gear going straight into your bottomless stash, which can be accessed at any time while you're out in the field. Combat itself benefits greatly from a rule system designed specifically for a video game. Rather than a clunky pen and paper adaptation, Pillar's system introduces more manageable concepts like per and counter abilities, real-time duration effects, and a far more intuitive set of core statistics that won't gut your character if you make a non-traditional choice. Obsidian likes to use the example of bumping up the might stat for a brawny, powerful wizard, rather than sinking points into the more traditional intellect stat. As with any new system, it definitely does take a little getting used to. There's some reworked terminology that even those familiar with the D&D rules will have to wrap their heads around, but once it clicks, it really works. A really nice touch to mention is that when you switch over to hard mode, rather than just cramming percentage increases and buffs onto the enemies, Obsidian has reworked each encounter in the game for a more challenging setup. For example, rather than encountering 3 ghouls, you might encounter 4 accompanied by a couple of pet spiders. That's a lovely conceit and one that's tempted me to try a hard mode run on my next playthrough. In terms of the basic swing by swing feel, combat is hugely satisfying. Melee strikes feel weighty and impactful, and Obsidian has done a great job coming up with some really pyrotechnic spell effects. The best battles have you anxiously staring at the screen, considering your options as your heavy hitters get taken out of the equation. Should you throw a fireball, try to knock that big guy down, or maybe activate the withdrawal ability on your rogue to try and flank that vulnerable wizard at the back? There's so many options at your disposal, and so many individually cool and clever ways to clear an encounter. To be honest, I could go on for another hour or two on Pillars of Eternity, and be no closer to really feeling like I've done this ridiculously huge game justice. I could talk about the clever resting system, which forces you to be very careful about where and when you choose to refresh your party's spells. I could discuss the beautiful descriptive writing, which effortlessly paints a vibrant picture of each of your companions without the need for lengthy animated cutscenes. Speaking of which, the companions are great. Mad Monk Durance, likeable, easygoing Adair, hard-as-nails Hunter Sagani, and Wizard Aloth, whose particular ailment provides some much-needed comic relief, but also has some hidden depths that become clear as your story goes on. All you really need to know though is this: Pillars of Eternity is a triumph. If you're a backer and a fan of those classic Infinity Engine games, you're in for a real treat, a smart and complex adventure that will keep you entertained and absorbed for possibly the rest of your life, and certainly until the already announced expansion pack comes out. Even those who never got on with those classic games should also give it a go, because there's a ton of smart design choices in there that smooth out the rough edges that might have kept you away before. This is a superb introduction to a fascinating new fantasy world, and I can't wait to see where in the world of Eora we get to go next. Pillars of Eternity gets a highly recommended 9 out of 10.